I'm on the planning board. I'm also an architect, and I live just right up the road on Route 237. Tonight, this is the fourth in a series of talks relating to the efficacy of allowing industrial solar electric production plants on farmland here in Stafford. I'm sorry for reading off the sheet. Sandy just handed it to me when I left the door. This inquiry turns out to be quite complicated. The study areas are many, and they include what needs solar projects fulfill in our town, what does climate, weather, the sun, and the environment have to do with the study, what will the consequences be of having an industrial solar electric production plant placed in our town, the role of government, tax implications, laws, subsidies, property rights, monetary implications, and non-aggression principles as it relates to the citizens, monetary implications, economics of renewable energy, farmland, industry, soil placement. I'm going to go on this. Keep reading. Infrastructure, substations, and an aging grid, refraction and electromagnetic radiation, visual transformations versus need, wildlife and ecosystem, health effects, decommissioning, and soil reclamation. Now, those are just some topics we're looking into as part of the committee, which I'm also a part of. Oh, wait a second here. Well, I don't have to, as I read on. I'd like to introduce our Stafford committee actually, before I do that, I want to acknowledge that in the room we have Supervisor Clement, we have Councilman Batiste, and Councilman Ken. And also other members of the Stafford Solar Committee that we're calling ourselves. Luann is here. Luann McKenzie in the back. She's a dairy farmer. Colleen isn't here, I don't believe. Colleen O'Connor is also on the board. Len, I don't believe is here. Len Jasinski, he's an engineer. Myself, Lowell, I think I saw Lowell named self-employed, and of course David Swanson, who's organized this and had all these wonderful speakers come in and talk to us. Okay. So, our presenter tonight is Derek Meister. I can't give you much information on him because he has managed to not be very Google friendly, which is a testament to yourself, I believe. But you do, well, you're right. But from what I understand is you go around the state providing presentations to folks like us on the New York State Unified Solar Law. And please fill us in on any other information about yourself that you'd like us to know. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Yes, so my name is Derek Meister. I work for the PV Trainers Network from NYSERDA. I actually work out of Sustainable CUNY in New York City, and along with a couple of our major partners in tech engineering, Meister Consultants Group, and Pace Land Use Law Center, we help go around the state, like was just mentioned, training either on the technical end of how solar works, or just policies in general. Today we'll be focusing on the state's Unified Solar Permit. All the kind of nuances about the permit, and also kind of how to adopt it legislatively, and then also how it works with state incentives, how the towns or the jurisdictions at large, when they adopt, can get the money from the state for actually implementing this work. So, just getting right into it. The NYSERDA initiative is a part of REV at the state level, which has a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030, based on 1990 levels, and also generating energy from 50% renewable sources. Part of that is an actual mandate for solar. The statewide goal is 3 gigawatts, and there's been nearly $1 billion put forth to make this happen. And this is just for solar specifically. So beyond the actual technologies and the trends of the technologies, it's also creating this PV trainers network, for example, to help educate municipalities, understand how trends do change, but also understand the benefits of one, renewable energy on the environment, but also the economy. Again, the PV Trainers Network is essentially aimed to focus on what we call soft costs in solar procurement. We'll get into that in a little bit, but essentially towns have a huge role to play in these kind of hidden costs that can definitely add up, and the margins on solar projects are generally pretty tight to begin with, and just helping streamline and understand for the private sector, for the actual solar installers and developers, what they're getting into within a jurisdiction, whether it's at the town level or all the way at the county level. Can really help make things move forward quicker. Again, this is the remainder of our groups kind of calling out some of our major supporting organizations. We work a lot with educational institutions around the state, so we have a good reach and some home bases so that we can actually get to territories all over. As you can see this now. So we're going to begin with those soft costs that I mentioned, how they relate to the market, how they relate to a job's economic viability, and then get into the specifics of the permit, how it started, the initiatives behind implementing it in the first place, some previous versions before we got to the version we're at now. We're going to go through the specifics of the version, the current version of the Unified Solar Permit, and then of course, how to adopt different methods, how to prove it to the states that when you do adopt, you get the incentives that are offered for them, and also how it ties into CEC. I think many of us might be familiar with the Clean Energy Communities Program, the incentives, the high impact actions, the Unified Solar Permit being one of those 10 high impact actions for needing to be adopted by a jurisdiction and able to qualify for additional incentives funds through CEC, which is different than the funds that are offered for adopting the permit specifically. So, just a little, does it go? Sorry, no. So just beginning, we are going to learn a little bit about the New York State solar market. As you can see, these data goes back to about 2007. I'd say the huge solar boom that we had in the state was around 2010, 2011, and really took off around 2012, 2013. And the biggest trends around that 2012 up to 2016 was a nearly exponential growth, just huge interest within the state. We'll get into reasons why different states might have better viability for solar in the first place in a second, but also obviously following trends in the technology itself. Prices come down as more people understand how to use this technology, but also efficiencies are gained. So what you're paying for actually gives you more bang for your buck. The actual utilization of the solar in terms of producing electricity, solar energy. So in conjunction with the rise of solar adoption within the state, there's also the average cost for residential solar. Might be a good idea to throw out. This will focus on residential solar. The Unified Solar Permit is only for systems 25 kilowatts or below. Generally, residential system size is on the bigger end, but would also lines up with the rest of the state incentives in terms of interconnection and the other incentives from the megawatt block, if everyone's familiar. And maybe just a tidbit on the megawatt block, if no one is familiar. Essentially, that's a cash-based incentive for the specific systems that go up. So the state offers a certain amount of money per installed capacity. So you get a few $1,000s per kilowatt, for example. Not directly a few thousand per kilowatt, but it's literally money for the size of the system that's built. So the 25 kilowatt system size relates back to those incentives, but also it is a little bigger, so just to keep in mind, it could cover systems that are small commercial as well. But the residential average solar cost after the installed price, so including the hardware, including these soft costs, which again we're going to go into in a second, has dropped dramatically. And again, around that same period I mentioned a second ago, 2010 to 2015, the biggest drops at 55%. And they're still lowering. Again, I would say 2016 was kind of our last best year in terms of growth data. Things are leveling off, but that's to be expected from a growing market that's landing on its knees, landing on its feet, and figuring out how to mature, move forward, utilize other technologies such as batteries. And then you can see how those prices also relate to just the overall average installed cost. So this includes commercial solar. Generally, residential solar is more costly. You have to do more work for a smaller system. Economies of scale get bigger when you can build larger system sizes. So when you put all of them together, the trends are still lowering, but residential system prices are generally a little higher than commercial. Something to keep in mind. So this is a good graph that overviews kind of the breakdown between the actual equipment costs of solar versus these outlier costs, which include customer acquisition, includes permitting fees, permitting the time it takes to permit, things like that. Obviously, time is money. As time adds up, the costs get reflected back onto the solar developers, which then get reflected back onto the consumers for higher installed prices. So generally, we see that the soft costs take up about 2/3 of the overall cost, which, by the way, are measured in dollars per watt. So this was around 2015. The average cost of residential solar was $3 per watt. So about 2/3 of that is allocated to these soft costs, which are broken down, again, just general, kind of beyond the actual equipment themselves, the kind of steps to get the project up and running. So you have to go out and generate leads, knock on people's doors, who's interested in solar. Otherwise, they get these leads generated to them. They still have to go out to every site and make sure that the home is viable. All of that costs money, but it's not obviously a part of the system, the hardware cost of the system, so the actual solar panels, the inverters, the racking. And then here we have the permitting inspection as the second blue, so above that green area. Obviously not the biggest factor within these soft costs, but still everything adds up. So in connection with solar itself, there's also the high energy prices within New York. This is an updated graph for average prices throughout the country per state. I think we're at number 7, which is better. We used to be at number 4. So you combine the one, solar accessibility. Obviously, you need to have a good solar access, no shading. But also, the value of the solar that's produced is determined by how much you have to pay for electricity, right? So, under the current method of net metering, you can receive a direct kilowatt-hour credit value for a direct kilowatt-hour of solar generated, and that is put back into the grid. So essentially, a 1-to-1 credit ratio. And because of those higher prices, solar companies are definitely interested in coming to New York State, where the project finances work out a little easier. And then obviously Hawaii is way up there in terms of electrical prices, being an island. And they've had a lot of issues with energy. Pretty good solar growth as well, but also finding out that, it's also related to the grid at large, right? So nothing is ever isolated. Everything is related, especially when you're dealing with energy prices and energy at large. So, coming into New York State as a developer, private installer, potentially you have over 1,550 local jurisdictions within New York State. Technically, because New York is a home rule state, each of these jurisdictions could have different permitting requirements. Generally, that's not necessarily the case for all 1,550 jurisdictions, but that means when you move from kind of just one larger area, say the Genesee, Finger Lakes area down to maybe Westchester, those processes will be different. A solar installer that wants to grow, that wants to be able to streamline, work with economies of scale kind of at a larger company level, not necessarily a project level, they will have to relearn all of these processes per jurisdiction, potentially. And it is the case at large, but again, definitely not 1,550 individual permitting processes. So obviously, you can group these 1,550 plus jurisdictions into counties, cities, towns, and then you get down to villages. So obviously, you can aggregate at a town level, multiple towns within a county. If the county has these towns on board, they kind of potentially can adopt the unified solar permit as a county, and that would mean all the jurisdictions within there have been in agreement with this, adopt this permit, and it's the same for that whole county. Otherwise, it can be done at the city level as well. And some cities like to, work through their own local laws versus working with other cities and the counties. But that is discretionary, again, in a home rule state. So with all of this information, some of the market players kind of keeping an eye on the trends, sustainable CUNY being one of them, some of our partners, Pace Law Center, etc. We're noticing that solar was going to be kind of a hot commodity around 2010, 2011, and that there were some of these outstanding kind of questions, and what could you do to address them? And one of them was basically to create and develop a unified solar permit. It started off through this NYSERDA Smart and DOE Sunshot Initiative grant, where they were surveying, benchmarking, kind of figuring out the status quo that existed at that time. And obviously, along with NYSERDA, NYPA were big proponents of developing this in the first place. So from those surveys, we essentially got that permitting is required for every solar project, right? That is going to be the case wherever you go. But a lot of jurisdictions, one, didn't necessarily understand the solar technology, especially within the building departments, if that was going to be a different process. Obviously, it's electrical installation as well, but they require an electrical permit, an electrical inspection, just a construction permit, construction inspection. And this is essentially what the Unified Solar Permit was created to help facilitate. So in the end, another term for those soft costs is balance of system costs, and basically 64% of the respondents said that these costs were going to be 64% of the residential installed system price from 150 projects in the area that were responded to were based off of these soft costs. So whether it's permitting, again, customer acquisition, paying installers, overhead, and general operations and maintenance as well. This was something that could be addressed at the jurisdictional level. So before the state took on this initiative, there was already a Long Island permit, Long Island solar permit, and this was one tool that helped influence what the state's unified solar permit would look like. And along with the solar ABCs, Solar America Board of Codes and Standards, essentially a group of expert solar developers, solar engineers at large, electrical engineers, get together, essentially kind of talk through the trends and standards of installations, which also influence the actual requirements for these installations. So going to the electrical code or going to the listing agencies like the Underwriters Laboratory or UL. These are definitely kind of the experts in the field at large. But also, I mean, just based off the success of the Long Island solar permit, just combining the two and figuring out what information is necessary for these towns to know within their building department to keep track of, to have a record of, as well as influencing prices, how it relates to the local codes at large. Everything is trying to be considerate, but again, The first version that did exist of the state permit was a little bit more prescriptive, and then with this new permit that we'll go into a little bit later, it kind of opened up those requirements, just keeping in mind that we are a home rule state and not every jurisdiction is going to be the same, have the same capabilities and capacity. But in general, obviously there are a few different benefits of adopting the unified solar permit. One for the municipalities themselves, but also for the people on the ground that have to actually look at these projects to make sure they're safe, to make sure that they're going to be installed correctly, namely building departments, potentially planning departments, engineering departments, and also for, of course, the solar industry itself. So obviously, there are these actual economic values to renewable energy beyond even the environmental effect. It is a new kind of technology trend. Everyone's excited. It generates training for local electricians or even just kind of local construction workers learning a new technology. They'll be able to take this back, potentially run with it in whatever way they like, but also generate local taxes and whatnot, etc. When these solar developers come into a town and generate these projects in the first place, but also for the solar industry, as we've mentioned before, went through a little bit. Essentially, they have more of an understanding at large of what they have to do. They work with the unified solar permit in another jurisdiction. They know what's required when they're moving into a new jurisdiction. To make that transition easier. So, some of you might be familiar with this first version of the state permit. Again, this is based off of solar ABCs in the Long Island permit. The Long Island permit was even more simple than this, but this was essentially just a 2-page kind of application form. And originally it was limited to 12 kilowatts systems, which, as I mentioned a second ago, was expanded to 25 kilowatt systems now. And they also, again, being more prescriptive, did not allow fees for these permits to be more than $150, and steered municipalities towards just keeping them as flat fees in general. And also a requirement to review and assess and approve or reject these permits within 14 days. Again, it's been kind of opened up a bit, and we'll go into those specifics. So it looks a little bit better, it looks a little bit different. Instead of it just being kind of like a 1-page front and back, technically 2 pages, it now comes with 5 pages altogether. The first 2 pages itself are the ones that are the application and the permitting requirements up front. And then the last 3 pages are where a town can kind of fill in the blanks, give more information about their processes, their local laws, maybe a specific requirement within an electrical code that might be different from another jurisdiction, and as well as contact information, etc. They are listed on these pages as well, but they are able to be gone more in depth on the following 3 pages. So it begins with this eligibility checklist. So things like, what's the size of the system? Is it below 25 kilowatts? Check. Is all the equipment like listed equipment? If you're familiar, there's a state requirement as well as utility requirements that only approved and listed equipment can be used as a part of these systems. Check. So you go through that whole list. If everything is yes, then they can submit this project to this town. If there is one thing that's a no, either work with the town, maybe there's an architectural review board that's required for a certain project. If they check no, regarding that, there are additional reviews required. They can go work with an architectural review board, go back to this checklist, check it off as yes, everything checks out, then you can submit the project. The submission instructions, generally most towns can handle online submissions. That's not necessarily a requirement. This is where you can list the specifics of that. Does it have to be in person? Where is it? Is it electronic? And then obviously the review timelines is the next section here. Again, went away from being prescriptive to a maximum of 14 days, but essentially the goal is to have towns kind of work within themselves internally together. So you have the council members that want to enact this, but then they have to go back and understand if the building department can really accept what they think is a higher volume of these jobs coming in, and kind of talking through these processes, you know, come to a time that seems reasonable for everybody involved. And contact information. So the timelines is a decent segue into the other parts that would kind of take kind of a consensus within the town. So we'll get into the fees on the next page, but timelines, fees, things like that will be determined by the town, but if it's not in the spirit of creating this unified solar permit, once it's submitted to NYSERDA for review, they might not accept it. So say you come up with a 30-day review timeline. You know, that's kind of against the whole point of having a unified solar permit, especially when the first one was based off of a 14-day maximum. Maybe they'll write back, say, can you review this a little bit more internally, see if you can bring those numbers down. We'll accept it after that kind of thing. That's a part of the incentive process as well. So then you get into more of the specifics, laying out exactly where this system will be, the address, etc. What type of use is this property? Is it single family, multifamily, etc. And then system sizes, how the system will be interconnected. Really quickly, interconnection can happen in a few different ways. If you have string inverters, which kind of take all of the solar panels on a rooftop, take it from DC energy to AC energy all at once, versus something called microinverters, which would do it on an individual panel basis. Those have to be connected at some point after the fact. And then from there, that goes into the meter, into the grid, called the interconnection. You can either interconnect straight, essentially between the meter and the main panel of someone's home, or you can add in a breaker if the size of that main panel is big enough to accept the loads of the system. And that is a checkbox right here, kind of a quick way to just understand how the system is put together without looking at the plans. So have that information all up front. And then of course the actual solar installer's information, so their contractor's license, if they're working with an electrician, third party, or if they have one in-house kind of thing. And then the verification that this is an approved system with the property owner's signature as well as the installer's signature. So those are the main two pieces of form work for the actual permit application. And then you get into the kind of attachment pages or the addendum pages where you can kind of fill out a little more of those things in depth. So again, the actual requirements, if there's anything that's a nuance, it's going to be different. Within this jurisdiction, this is your chance to kind of list out in depth what is different, what you know to be different, as well as just the general process. So get pretty long. Getting into plan review timelines, who's going to do it, the location, again, is it the building department, is it a planning department, is there going to be a solar specific person that's going to be looking at this, will they be able to speak with the developers, and will the developers be able to speak with them? Fees, it can be a general sentence, this is how much it costs, it can be a schedule. So instead of the prescriptive $150, no more than $150 flat fee requirement, it's opened up against to the town's discretion. So again, going back and speaking internally, you know, how many jobs do you think are going to come in? What are fees for other types of projects? How does it relate to these size systems, the type of work that it is? Do we want to do it based off of kind of a step size increase? So you start off maybe 5 kilowatt systems are lower priced, 10 kilowatt systems are a little bit higher, 25 will be at this highest point. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this will be taken back, NYSERDA will review, and if it's too onerous, if it's too extreme, if it's too against the principles of having a unified solar permit, then they will write back, not necessarily accept at once, and then work with the town to figure out something that might make a little more sense. Again, within the capabilities of what the town or jurisdiction can handle. And then it gets into the inspection process and outlines how inspections will work. So this is related to actually approving and closing out a job. So after the town checks off that it's okay, the permits can be closed out. The developer needs to have that actual check mark and close out to actually submit their project to then get the state fund, incentive funds, where they can get that actual cash back for the size of the system. But if the inspection process is confusing, and that's also what the PV Trainers Network is here for, we can offer trainings about how solar works specifically, kind of best practices, what we notice to be common mistakes, and work with municipalities in order to train their inspectors, and then obviously come up with a reasonable timeline for when that inspection can take place, and of course relate back to those standards at large. Right, and then the final page, just additional resources. The state has a lot of resources that can be plugged in here. Maybe the town has resources that it's developed itself, can be plugged in here as well. Maybe a whole website kind of a thing, et cetera, et cetera. And then again, another space for the overall department contact information. So not potentially different or the same as the previous section. Is it the whole department at large? Is it one person? That kind of thing. So those are the overall aspects of the permit. Pretty straightforward, not too onerous at all. I would say, especially compared to a place like New York City, there's maybe like 15 different pieces of paperwork that's required to be submitted, different plan set requirements in terms of including elevations and whatnot, versus in smaller municipalities, just kind of needing to know that main information that made up front, which can be looked at on the front and back of one sheet, and then have a snapshot of what this system will be, how it will work, and then of course the actual plan requirements per the jurisdictional requirements. So probably a site plan, a specific plan of the design of the solar system, and then potentially an electrical diagram, not necessarily though. So again, Long Island Unified Solar Permit was launched previous to the state's version in 2009. Pretty great successes. Long Island had a decent solar boom before the rest of the state by a couple years. And the Unified Solar Permit, we saw the original version. That yellow one was launched in 2013. And then we saw this kind of sleeker looking version that was launched in 2016. So that original version was accepted up until October of 2016, but now the whole state has been transitioned to the form that we just went through. So out of those 1,550 plus jurisdictions so far, there's only officially been 203 adopted. And that is across the state though. So from places like, obviously Albany all the way through to West Hempstead. Again, now kind of just lumping the different versions of the permit into one. So aggregating from Long Island through the rest of the state, we have 203 adopted. And it's a pretty decent list. Again, covers a good area of the state. But some of them are, again, kind of coalitions of towns at a county level. Some of them are even all the way down to incorporated village level. But that is up to the local jurisdiction. So, we went through some of these at a higher level, but to actually officially adopt it, it's definitely, I don't think it's possible to adopt it without reviewing it with the relevant agencies and the relevant department. But obviously also understanding the local code requirements, maybe working with the local council. Does it have to be legislated, or can it just be essentially incorporated into the building department's process? After kind of the internal review and understanding that moving forward with adoption is agreed upon, then making those tweaks to the kind of general framework is up to the town. So going through those fees, inputting the building department address, adding the town seal to the permit itself, personalizing it for your jurisdiction. again, fees and timelines. So not only fees for the actual permitting application, but also timelines for the review of that permit, and then timelines for inspections as well. So officially adopting it again can mean simply just even accepting an application with this permit after all those tweaks have been made, it's been posted online. If that's okay with the town's kind of local laws, maybe that it's as simple as that. Otherwise, it might require a legislative codifications to say this is what we're doing in our town. Again, there's no kind of blanket guidance in that sense, since we're a home rule state and every town has so many different local laws. So then a town can just start using the permit, and all solar jobs that are 25 kilowatts or below can go through, and hopefully more of these size systems will be going into the town. All right, so coming back to the incentives, again, there's two different kinds. PON 2721 is for adopting the permit itself. PON 3298 is the CEC high impact action program, which offers a significant amount of more money, but it's also related to the other high impact actions that jurisdiction would adopt as well. We'll get into these. I think, yeah, we'll get into it in a second. The differences between the two, just up front, essentially, the permit adoption incentive will always be available until funds run out, whereas the CEC one is kind of a first come, first served, and there's a pool of money allocated for different levels. So if you're one of the first towns that have gone through all these high impact actions, you get the highest pool of money. There's only 2 slots available. Once it's taken up, then you have to go down to the next one where there's less money offered, but more slots available until they don't get stuff. So with PON 2721, pretty straightforward. Different allowances for different size municipalities. So for 30,000 or less size population, you get a maximum of 2,500. For over 30,000, you get $5,000. And again, that's just for adopting it and implementing it and actually using it. So it can go towards and be used for essentially anything. The goal would be related to renewables, but it could be streamlining the website, helping pay to actually put the work in to make the changes to it, to put the town logo on it, and then get it up on the website. Probably not worth $5,000, but it could be used for anything. This one does run out in 2019, unless NYSERDA reviews the legislation and then extends it after that, which they have done once already. For PON 3298, again, it's based off of having 4 of 10 listed high impact actions. The Unified Solar Permit is probably the easiest high impact action to adopt. And again, the money is significantly higher, and it's dependent as well on population size. But you can check the CEC website on NYSERDA to see where the current status of this is, and I did see that the highest tiers were already taken up. So I think there's 6 left for $50,000 and 2 left maybe for $100,000. Yeah, but that's of course for the larger cities. So this is also on the same time frame. It ends in 2019 until the funds run out or until NYSERDA decides to extend. And here's a list of the full 10 high impact actions. Again, out of all of these, simply adopting a solar permit, if it is as simple as just accepting it in the building department, is probably the easiest one. All of these other ones, Solar Edge program is the other solar related one. That's actually running a campaign to do group purchasing for residential houses, if anyone is familiar. Then there's also benchmarking, clean fleets, LED lights, a little more intensive to actually prove that it's been underway and prove that it's been completed versus adopting a permit.
What is climate smart community?
So that's just another state level, I'm not as familiar with the details of it, but it's just another state level certification for adopting renewable initiatives at large. I don't know the specifics of what is required in order to become a climate smart community. You can check in on that. All right, so in order to actually submit for PON 2721, obviously the permit has to be adopted and it has to show proof that it has been adopted, and there's a few different ways of doing that. If it has to be codified by the town, just that copy of that local law would be enough. Otherwise, a letter from the building department, the planning department that it is being used, or an actual finished and accepted and approved permit. So again, just simply adopting it, going with it and using it, and then showing that to NYSERDA is proof that it has been adopted within the jurisdiction. Putting it up on the website is a bigger requirement as well. It has to be available online. The kind of blank version, the generic version, comes in a Word format on NYSERDA's website. And I would recommend, after making the tweaks for fees and timelines, turning it into that PDF and then hosting it on the website and under the building department. So then, once all of this is aggregated and put together, you use the consolidated funding application process and work with NYSERDA to see if the permit does fit within the goals of having a streamlined process. Okay, so for PON 3298, again, you have to have 4 of the 10 high impact actions completed and essentially work with the CEC organizers. I believe there is a couple for every territory around the state. The territories are broken up. This territory is the Genesee Finger Lakes area. I'm not sure the CEC representative has ever made their way down here. But working with them, you can submit the high impact actions as they're completed. They don't have to be done all at once. And 2 of them have to be adopted after 2016. So some towns might have been on the forefront of adopting kind of green initiatives. They can't use all of those as a part of their 4 high impact actions if they relate to those 10 categories. So if a town had adopted the solar permit a few years ago, then that could be one, and then they have to have 2 more that were then implemented after that. So a whole solarized campaign after that date. And then essentially it's a similar process as well as the PON 2721. So either have the copy from the acceptance email from NYSERDA where they did give you the incentive for adopting the permit in the first place, or even just looking on NYSERDA's list of communities, which is hosted on nysolarmap.com. If anybody's familiar with that, pretty great resource at large, and this list is updated hopefully monthly, and every once in a while it's closer to every 2 months. And the timelines can be about that as well. So NYSERDA can get back, I would say the soonest could be within a couple weeks, generally a month. It can get up to a couple months depending on how many people are submitting their CFAs. So again, you can go to NYSERDA's website, find the Word document version of the permit, work with your town, work with the legal advisors, work with the building department, make those tweaks, turn it into a PDF, and simply just put it up on your website, let everyone know that they can use this process now, and hopefully get more residential solar installed more quickly as well. And as you can see, a little older, from 2014, the city of Yonkers went through this process, obviously with the first version of the state unified permit, but you can see for about 5 years in this area, or in this section, there were a total of 106 installations and they took around 10 days to permit. In the next 2-year period, from 2014 to 2016, they had 168 installations overall. So within a 2-year time frame, had already beat how much was installed within the previous 5 years, and were able to keep that review timeline at 10 days. So they had a huge influx of business coming in, but also had the capacity and the streamlined process to review them without increasing the timelines. And then, of course, a small drop in the price of their systems as well over that time frame, but that's also related to the actual technology, just larger trends overall, but can be attributed to small actions like adopting the unified solar permit, unquestionably. And there are really great resources that NYSERDA and NYSERDA put together. The solar guidebook for local governments goes through the tech side as well as permitting standards, installation standards, just most things that a local government has questions about are really well gone through within the solar guidebook. But for the permit specifically, CEC does have a toolkit and a specific website on NYSERDA, all related to the permit. And if you're going for the CEC incentive, then working with that CEC rep would be recommended as well. They would have to document it as it's happening. At the same time that once all high impact actions are adopted and finished, then submitting it to NYSERDA with that CEC rep. And something to note, the PV Trainers Network, as it has existed for the last 3 years, is going to go through a kind of internal shuffle. NYSERDA is going to kind of revamp the program starting in 2018. So this portal, as it currently exists, is still available until the end of the year. And again, we do offer trainings from the technical side through to the policy sides, covering a lot of different topics, and can still be done. But if you want to get that kind of in-depth review, which I think over the last 3 years our organization has done really good work with, kind of put in a request as soon as we can. And one really good one being the land use planning for solar and zoning for solar energy. Jessica Bosher from Pace Land Use Law Center helped basically write the model solar law for New York State, help implement all of these trainings, understanding zoning at large, but also how different municipalities can accept different projects depending on, some municipalities of course have industrial and manufacturing districts, other municipalities might not, and those would impact what types of local laws and zoning regulations would be adopted by different towns, of course. And that is the overview of the permit specifically. So again, definitely recommended, especially if anybody would like to go for that CEC grant. And of course, you can still get a few $1,000s for just adopting it by itself anyways. So thank you guys, and I'll be around for a few questions if anybody has any. We can open it up from beyond the permit. And I'm not necessarily an expert in other areas as much as some of my colleagues, but definitely can at least give some higher level responses and of course take everything back and see how we can connect people to the right people if necessary. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. And are there questions? Do we have questions, Ron?
A few of them. I don't know if you'll be able to answer them though. There was a big fall off in 2016 to 17. Did some type of incentive program fall off, or did it just?
Not quite, no. The incentive programs are still there. One thing that did happen though is a change from the net metering policy. So something called BER was announced it was announced last year, but it's been implemented this year. And it essentially changes that 1-to-1 credit ratio that I talked about previously and makes it a lot more complicated. So that is not going to be the case for residential for the next year at least, the 1-to-1 credit ratio will still stay the same for residential systems, but for larger systems, solar companies trying to figure out the economic value, like how much solar will generate how much money, is a little up in the air at the moment. And NYSERDA is coming out with this calculator and whatnot to release to the solar installers so that they can have this information, figure out how to build these projects. That would probably be the biggest gap. But other than that, I would say a lot of it just has to do with kind of the market has matured. We won't always see these exponential increases, obviously. Capacity-wise, you know, the aggregate will always increase, but each year won't have, you know, twice as many installs as the next year forever, and I think we're hitting that point as well.
25 kilowatt and up, how's that permitted?
That is up to the town's discretion as well. I mean, just leaving it up to the standard processes, I would say, obviously, a construction permit would always be required. At that size system, electrical permits should probably start being required. Less of a question if it's necessary or not from 25 and up. And then it might depend on zoning as well. So if there are other considerations for if it's just a residential property on the ground versus on the roof of kind of like a warehouse. And then, of course, yeah.
So does Article 10 kick in at 25 kilowatts or?
No, so I don't quite remember, but Article 10 is pretty large. I want to, maybe I shouldn't, I want to say something closer to like the hundreds though. So 200 kilowatts is when Article 10 kicks in. We've seen it a lot regarding wind projects because those are inherently that size versus solar projects can run from a few kilowatts all the way up to even a megawatt. Generally, wind projects will always be in the hundreds of kilowatts to megawatt size range.
Hey Derek,
Yep.
Dan Peltel with Cypress Creek here. Just to answer that question in more detail, Article 10 is triggered at projects, any energy system that's over 25 megawatts.
Megawatts, oof, that's a lot.
So that'd be, what was that, 10,000 times the size of a 25 kilowatt system.
Yep.
And for anything, actually what is required across the state is anything not included in a standard permit would be under the purview of the local zoning code.
Right, and it's my understanding that that is being addressed and discussed currently, at least within the Town of Stafford. There's a moratorium, I believe, so that this work can be underway. Right. So if those zoning laws don't exist, I mean, that's the time where those requirements can be implemented.
Yeah. Another detail too is that we're not aware of any size projects that are larger than 2 megawatts in the Town of Stafford area. I think the closest Article 10 project you would see is on the other side of the state right now. So they're pretty rare to find.
No, it's good. So really the incentive is just for the residential ones
Yes.
and then at the smaller side of the commercial ones.
Exactly.
Because really our moratorium doesn't cover the residential ones.
Oh, interesting. So so the systems were still being installed within the town. I see. Yeah, that's right. I do remember that. What stage of the moratorium is that?
3 months in,
3 months in. Okay. 3 months.
around March 1st, we're thinking about having it wrapped up if we're finished.
Can you talk at all to the New York State Model Solar Energy Law?
Do you want to say it again so everyone could
The
hear?
New York State Model Solar Energy Law?
Yeah, so I'm not as familiar with that actually, but definitely someone we work pretty close with, the Pace Land Use Law Center, Jessica Besher. She helped write it essentially, and she would definitely be the best person and has worked throughout the state helping towns understand.
How to craft these numbers?
Yes, exactly. She even works, I mean, on the ground directly with the
Right.
towns and specific issues. Yep.
Right.
Any other questions from our education committee? Lowell? Nothing? Anyone else?
Yeah, maybe, man.
Yeah.
Say like a residential system is maybe 4,000 or 5,000 watts. About what percentage of a rebate would there be from the state?
So at that size,
You're looking at maybe $15,000 or so for a residential system. What percentage, or how much would the state or NYSERDA give as an incentive to install?
so that is a little tricky. There might not be internet in here. So the megawatt block program is set up so that the highest rates began at about 60 cents per kilowatt hour. And it steps down as these tranches are kind of reached. So that incentive lasted for, I don't quite know the number specifically, but let's say 100. After that 100 was met, it stepped down to 50 cents, for example, for 90 projects. And it keeps doing that. I don't know where they're currently at, but I would say it's probably closer to about 30 cents a kilowatt hour. So then you have to do a little conversion, but it could be still, I mean, up to tens of thousands of dollars for about that size system. Yeah, I'm sorry. If I could bring it up, that would probably be the best.
The gentleman from Leroy, did you have a question?
I'm just a homeowner.
Yep.
And I saw it in the Batavian, and
Thank you for coming.
quite honest with you, I live in the midst of about 17 acres of farmland. And I've heard rumors that they're trying to develop it into a housing project. So I'm thinking some way to keep it from going to a housing project that would at least sustain itself.
Yes,
So
definitely.
I came here to just, I was wondering about, grants and stuff like that. We're saying rebates, which mean you put the money in first and then you get the money back.
So there are different kinds. Generally, the installers will always handle this. Obviously, homeowners can work, more or less with them, be more involved. I would say understanding is always the best part, but essentially, the installers usually, kind of make all of the economic calculations, figure out the financing structure for how to even purchase it. Is it going to be a direct purchase? Is it going to be kind of a loan system? If it's a loan system, otherwise called PPAs, the outlay is all made by the developer, and the homeowner or property owner only pays for an agreed upon price for the electricity generated. So essentially, the assets are owned and operated and maintained by the solar installer. They receive the incentives directly. In that way, otherwise, if it's a direct purchase, it would depend on the size of the system. So that direct cents per kilowatt hour or kilowatt changes as the system size increases. So for more residential and small commercial systems, 200 kilowatts and below, they are based directly upon the cost of the project overall. So that is basically based upon the size of the system and then how much that system costs. And then per the expected return of energy produced, you get, say, 30 cents per of that kilowatt hour ratio, right? Versus larger systems above 200, they are based upon the cost of the actual system directly and not to do with the kilowatt hour generation at all. So one is performance-based and one is just directly cost-based. I would say it sounds like you would probably go for a larger system. And again, I would have to see the math specifically for this area, but you could be getting, a decent amount of cents per kilowatt. So instead of per kilowatt hour. So not production, but the capacity of the system.
Right, so something like, say 16 acres, that would be quite a large.
It would be quite large, yeah.
In just a
You would
ballpark.
probably be getting in a kilowatt size at that point.
And just as a ballpark figure, what do you think something like that would cost to install?
Megawatts get up to the hundreds of thousands. A few megawatts can get up to millions pretty quickly. Yeah.
So basically way over that.
Well, but PPAs, that's where PPAs come in. Yeah, PPAs are pretty attractive. They're actually one of the, I would say, most utilized methods of financing solar projects. But of course, this also relates to that VDER discussion for larger projects. How much are they going to get back when they put energy into the grid? As well as, kind of who works in the territory and area. And then you can get into the nuances with things like taxation and prime agricultural land that's being generated into something that's giving you income. There might be a tax implication there, little things like that.
Right, and there's not really any tax incentive breaks?
Not for large systems. There is a residential sales tax exemption, but that's for residential systems.
Yeah, those larger systems you're talking about are the kind of systems that we built. We built these community solar systems, and they're essentially built for people who can't build their own systems or don't want to or can't afford to. So instead of being able to build your own rooftop system or ground-mounted system in your backyard or on your land, we build them and people can sign up. Just no upfront costs, they can just subscribe to that solar system. We actually have a project close to the corporation, and each of those systems, right now, they're capped at 2 megawatts inside, so that's like the limit that you can build in the state. Beyond that, we may be able to build 5 megawatt systems in 2018 to 19. But that's really what kind of the 2 megawatt system will be able to power 300 to 600 homes globally. So make that power available to people that can't go through this permitting process or don't want to make that investment.
So you actually develop the whole structure, the infrastructure, everything like that?
Yeah, just like natural grid. We're sort of like a power company. People subscribe to it.
But as a private person, I would be able to own, say,
No.
The best part with community solar for you as the property owner would be getting probably some kind of a lease for utilizing the land, but the developer would own that system and manage all of the subscribers to it. But that is a really great point. Community solar was implemented a couple years ago, started taking off last year, and is getting huge currently. It's probably going to be a better trend of the future. These larger systems are going to be coming, so that you can distribute that resource to people that otherwise couldn't get it.
Yeah, already it's pretty competitive. It's actually more competitive than the cost of building and owning your own system. So it makes sense for a lot of people to sign on to a system rather than make the investment in their rooftop system.
and like the maintenance and upkeep, is that something that, is it?
We do, yeah.
And then would that cost come out of whatever monies that would be receiving?
No, we actually are required to sell at a fixed rate for 20 years, and because solar is so cheap, we're able to offer power across the state at a fixed rate below the utilities rate. So in this part of the state, we offer power 10% below the kilowatt hour rate, and that's just a fixed rate for 20 years, or however long you're a customer of the system.
If anything, I mean, it seems like there's a good crowd here tonight. There seems to be some interest in the community, and we can tailor trainings overall, so we can go over things like how to finance these jobs, how the incentives actually work, the current status of the incentives, which, sorry, I don't know off the top of my head. And it sounds like it might be useful. I mean, just as a consideration, just throw it out there. Get the zoning person up here, but combine it with a community solar as well as incentive training, kind of tailor it that way.
Yeah, I think we're actually going to be giving a panel talk at one of these events coming up. We're just trying to find a date for when that might be, but it looks like sometime in November.
Great.
Any other questions? Thank you very much, Derek,
Yeah,
for being
thanks,
here.
everybody.
Appreciate it, all the way from New York City. Thank you again. Inviting everybody to stay.